This fractured nation. The world is not what it was. Our nation is in ruins. I noticed the dog first. She watched me, at attention, her body close to a small girl with red hair who sat near a young woman with golden blonde curls snaking down her back. A few feet away, a blanket was covered with a small mound of tiny pups, all of them sleeping deeply. The dog gave a short bark, then wagged her tail at me. The young woman looked up, surprise on her face. I wondered if it was surprise at the dog's reaction, or was it that I was a stranger? Perhaps few people came this way, I wasn't sure. This had to be her, though, the girl I had been searching for. She was younger than I expected. She looked to be in her late teens, perhaps early 20s. I thought for a moment that, given the right set of circumstances, this girl could be my daughter's age, if Anna had lived. And for a moment the pain slammed into me, barely dulled by 20 years, still as gut-wrenching as ever. When menopause had come on last year, early at the tender age of 46, it had been a relief. I didn't need the monthly reminders that my ovaries and uterus had conspired against me, that they were not capable of bringing viable life into the world. It was a relief, really. I forced the memory away, met Jess's gaze, the corners of my mouth turning up in a friendly smile, and I raised my hand in greeting. "Hello there. You must be Jessica Aronson." I reached down and scratched the dog's ears as she nosed my legs. "And this must be Quincy." Quincy licked my hand, then settled down near Jess's feet again, her tail a steady thump against the ground. Her pups squirmed on a blanket nearby, beginning to wake up, their bodies a slowly writhing mass of tiny noses and twitching tails. I wondered what Jess must think of me. Now in my late 40s, I had slim, long legs, and I was taller than most women, far taller than my mother had been. My hair was long, straight, and dark, and I kept it braided in one thick rope down the middle of my back. The hair at my temples had begun to show gray last year, as did one long streak that ran the length of my long hair. Despite the cool fall day, I was wearing shorts and a sleeveless tank top with a rucksack resting on my shoulders. When Mother was younger, they had often pointed to me and called her my mini-me. They said it even as I grew taller than Mother, eventually towering over her by nearly 6 inches. So much for a mini-anything, but that had been years ago. Jess stared. Hello?" She sounded hesitant, but polite. Not afraid, but not overly friendly. "I'm Penelope," I said, sticking my hand out. The girl fumbled with the lamb's ear, and then quickly stood up to shake my outstretched hand. "I see you're collecting lamb's ear seeds," I said. "Do you work with other herbs?" Jess nodded, but did not elaborate. I smiled, curious about the girl's knowledge. Perhaps she was the one I needed to ask after an apprenticeship, not the young girl that the town doc had mentioned. "Do you know anything about the properties of lamb's ear, Jess?" "Only that it's making me nauseous. I don't like the weird smell." The young woman grinned ruefully back. I laughed. "Stop for a while, and I'll take over. I've gotten used to it." I sat down on the stoop, took the bucket from Jess, and began plucking at the dry flower heads. The leaves can be picked early, before it flowers, and can be dried and used in tea. You could also eat it in salads or steamed, but most people object to the furry aspect of it. The best use of lamb's ear is for small wound care. It is absorbent and soft and plentiful. But that isn't why I came here. I finished with one stalk and started on another. Suddenly I wasn't sure what to say, or how to say it. Here was the girl I had been looking for nearly 5 years. I was sure of it. But how do you jump into that? I found myself saying instead, "I've come to speak with you and David about Tina and a possible apprenticeship." Jess looked at me, frowning slightly. "Tina's only 10 years old." My hands didn't stop moving as I turned toward Jess and gave her a long, appraising look. I had spent time in the heart of the town, talking to Sarah Turner. She had described Jess as the go-to person for information on the town and its residents. After a few days of trade and work, I knew enough of the girl's history to know that she and her house full of kids had struggled through some pretty tough times in the past 6 or 7 years. Sarah had been forthcoming with details about Jess, telling me that Jess was busy writing down the lives and accounts of most of the residents of Belton and compiling a history of the area. She goes from house to house, usually during the winter, when there's not so much to do, Sarah had said. She writes down whatever memories they have of this war, of their families, of the time before, whatever someone wants to talk about, really. The woman had shrugged. I wasn't born here, but she even wanted my story. I had been as circumspect as possible. I had been searching a long time for the author of the letter I had found in the cave. I was sure that this Jess Aronson was the one that had seen Mom through her final days and buried her in the cairn outside her beloved cave. If you are reading this, then you undoubtedly know Madge. My name is Jess Aronson. I'm 16 years old. The letter was crumpled and tattered now, worn from reading and rereading it over and over. Well, I've heard from Dr. Ridley that she knows a lot about herbs and healing, I smiled and turned back to the lamb's ear. I've also come for a different reason. I've been looking for you for a long time now, nearly 5 years. You see, you knew someone very important to me. I let Jess digest this in a long moment of silence. When I looked over at her, the expression on the girl's face had turned from one of curiosity to one of fear. Sarah had hinted that the girl had been through terrible experiences before she returned to Belton nearly 7 years ago. I stopped and said, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you my full name. It's Penelope Fallingwater Astor. Dr. Madeline Fallingwater. You may have known her as Madge. She was my mother. The girl said nothing for a moment, her mouth falling open in shock. Oh my God. Grandmother Madge? The girl couldn't manage to put the words together, and I watched as the tears welled up in her eyes. I watched her for a moment. I had read the letter so many times, but I had still had my doubts. Had this girl and the other children truly loved my mother? Had Mother been at peace, surrounded by someone, anyone, who may have cared for her? Had they said the prayers that my mother's spirit required in order to find peace in the hereafter? Watching the younger woman now, seeing her reaction, it seemed that the letter had spoken true. Before I tell you how your friend or mother died, I want to tell you how she lived, how she gave us sanctuary and saved our lives by leading us here to this cave. The 4 of us, my newborn son Jacob, David, and Tina, both orphans from Clinton, and I have been here ever since September. I reached out and hugged Jess as my own tears began to slide down my nose. We were still hugging and crying when a young man in his late teens walked up a few minutes later, followed by a girl who looked very much like him. They both stood and stared at the 2 of us sobbing. The young man frowned. I am sure I do not need to tell you how special Madge was, or how much she came to mean to us. I lost my best friend in the world just days before she found us. I couldn't think. I was scared and lost. What's going on? Who is she? The girl asked the young man. He just shrugged and kept staring at us. The young girl's question, however, was enough to reduce the crying and elicit some basic explanation of who I was. 2 hours later, the sun had slipped low on the horizon and dusk was gathering. My husband, Kip, had joined us, and we had just finished nibbling the last kernels of corn off of the cob. I kept stealing glances at little Erin, the little girl with red curls. At nearly 4 years of age, she appeared to be in a growth spurt, her pants coming to rest high on her ankles, her top stretched tight, and her sleeves ended long before her wrists began. She was slender and pixie-like, her freckled skin slightly sunburnt, and her hair a mass of bright red curls. She maintained a steadfast silence, never speaking, except for the occasional giggle when David, the young man who had come upon us crying, tickled her. As dinner wrapped up, there was a quiet silence that descended upon the group. I looked at the bunch of them and marveled at their resilience. Jess was tall and graceful. Her skin was tanned a golden brown from working in the sun, and her hair fell in long curls down the middle of her back. David was in his mid to late teens, and his arms and chest were muscled and lean. They had served some stew with turkey and wild greens in it, and Jess had pointed to David, noting that he was the one who had landed them the turkey, using his bow. It was the same bow that Grandmother Madge had taught him to use. The end was peaceful. We were with her, holding her hands, and my baby Jacob nestled beside her. She loved to hold him, and he adored her. We all did. The sun had slipped down beyond the horizon. Pink and red streaks colored the clouds. The crickets had begun to sing, and the evening had a chill. They had spent hours describing their time with Grandmother Madge in the cave. Kip and I had pelted them with question after question. Kip especially seemed shocked that they had all spent a winter there. As dinner had wound down, Jess had put a pot of chicory coffee on to boil and handed out mugs full of it. I tasted it and was pleasantly surprised at the sweet taste. I raised my eyebrows and Jess grinned. I sweeten it with sugar beets. We grow them over there, 2 houses down, Jess said, pointing to the east. They had expanded their gardens to several yards, those they identified as having good soil, and others that had intact, tall fences. Especially when it came to foods that deer liked, the high fences had been effective in keeping out the local deer population that was exploding in spite of regular hunting. Grandmother Madge said you were in Europe, or was it Africa? Jess asked, dying to hear about the outside world. How did you get here? My face grew grim, as did Kip's. We glanced at each other for a moment, and I held out my mug to Kip for a refill. He was nearest the coffee pot. That has been an adventure, let me tell you. Have any of you heard much of what is going on in the outside world, outside of the former United States? I asked Jess and David. David frowned and said nothing. Jess answered, We heard that the collapse spread past our borders, that it was kind of like a domino effect. First the economic collapse, and then multiple civil wars and uprisings in places like Greece, the Middle East, even China after the US dollar collapsed. There were a lot of problems with the euro before the collapse, but afterwards, she shrugged. We lost power and internet, and my parents stopped talking about what was happening out there. She stared into the gathering darkness. Maybe it was too big, too frightening even for them. And then afterwards, after I returned with David and Tina and Jacob, well, we haven't exactly welcomed outsiders in Belton until more recently. The world has changed, I'm sure, but we only know what is nearby. There have been plenty of false starts into reasserting government on a broader level, but nothing that stuck. She gestured toward the town center. We have a militia, a mayor. For whatever they are worth, murmured David in disgust. Jess shot him a glance. And a basic town government in place. Every so often, someone gets their britches in a knot and wants something more and starts talking about money and taxes and the federal government. That doesn't last long. I nodded. When the United States collapsed, much of the world was already on the brink of complete chaos. The riots in Greece were just the beginning of what became an uprising, civil war, and eventually a full war throughout Europe. Even Switzerland couldn't sit this one out, and Africa had already been a hotbed, right along with the Middle East, so much infighting, along with the scourge of HIV and so many young people growing up without any parents, without any direction in their lives. I took a sip of the dark, heavily sweetened chicory and continued. We were traveling with an independently funded humanitarian aid mission in Uganda. The Lord's Resistance Army controlled much of the north at the time. The word got out that every American had better get out now, or else, I grimaced, as if it were that easy. Kip, who had said little at this point, took up the story. It took us nearly 2 years just to get out of Africa. Everything that could break down did. Communications, monetary systems, and the American embassies, or any embassies friendly to United States interests, were either closed, burned to the ground, or abandoned. The fact that we were Americans was suddenly a very bad thing. Luckily, we had friends, those who had been helped by our organization, by us. We stayed with a string of them until it became dangerous for them to keep us there. We eventually found our way to the Mediterranean and tried to enter Europe via Italy and later Spain. He shook his head. I continued. It seemed that all of Europe was either involved in uprisings, civil war, or fighting each other. More than anything, though, any Americans were turned away. We ended up with several others from our aid group on a freighter, bound for Port-au-Prince. It was the closest thing we had to the U.S., although anyone we spoke to told us there had been nukes set off in the south, and there were plenty of pointed fingers. I took another sip of the chicory, now cooled in the mug, and continued. In the end, we don't know how it started, or who pushed what buttons, but there were nuclear detonations recorded in Austin, D.C., and Los Angeles. It looks as if the Star Wars defense program took out most of the satellites in space at right around the same time, effectively ending worldwide communications. I stared at the bottom of my cup, my vision clouded by the events that came next. Kip waited for me to speak, and then he continued the story.
We knew the chances of finding Madge were unlikely. There had been such chaos in the cities. We wondered if she ever even made it out. Not to mention that she had told Penelope of her illness and that she didn't have long. Penelope had been scheduling a trip back to the States when everything went to hell. We just didn't hold out much hope. We stayed in Haiti for nearly 18 months, trying to stay alive and figure out where to go next.
I sat there for a moment, my eyes and mind miles away, lost in memories of Haiti. I didn't want to tell them of the disease, the murders, or how many times we had fought for just enough food to survive. I didn't want to talk about the children I saw lying dead in the streets. I shook it off with some effort. Florida was impossible. There were nearly a dozen naval bases there that banded together once communications with D.C. ceased. They patrol the waters and allow no one in. It's a fire first, ask questions later situation. They had locked it down to Florida residents anyway. Texas was a fallout zone, as was much of the Caribbean and the southern states. I pursed my lips. Not that they told Florida citizens that. They actively denied it, even after the first reports of radiation sickness. Once the Western Front started moving east into the Plain States, other factions of former military, along with extremists, rose up to define their own areas of control. Kip chimed in.
The Allied South struggled to consolidate Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and parts of South Carolina. Mexico had surged into Arizona, New Mexico, and the most southern section of California, and there was chaos there, lines drawn between the white, Hispanic, and Native American populations. The drug cartels made a move for power. The East Coast had 3 different contingents, the North Allies, who were struggling to define the borders of half a dozen small states, the Unionists, that controlled some parts of the Southeast, and the Patriots, who were hopelessly divided through infighting in Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana.
Jacob and Becca, who likely understood little of the states being discussed, having been born after the collapse, were silent. Erin had curled up in David's arms and was sucking her thumb, listening intently. I continued. We finally found entry just west of Biloxi, Mississippi. There had been a radiation fallout scare, and much of the area was deserted. We headed up Highway 49. After that, it was a zigzag route. We entered Tennessee, tried to go through the northwest section, but there was a chain of small towns, all with militias. We returned back at Tiptonville. I took another sip. The Western Front had torn through that region, and everyone was on edge. If you weren't a resident, they turned you away. No questions, no argument. I smiled wryly. After all, they were the ones with the guns. You can't argue much with the business end of a gun. Kip spoke up.
We spent a winter in Arkansas. There were migrant groups moving through the areas, many of them working crops, building and reinforcing town borders, living like gypsies as they searched for a place to stay. We moved in and out of these groups. Diseases we hadn't seen in decades in the Western world ran rampant. Cholera, bouts of dysentery, and a host of other illnesses could be found in any group we joined. But the alternative was to go it alone without some of the protection a group could provide. Sometimes it was worth it, other times it wasn't.
I picked it up from there. And eventually, we moved through parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and then finally Missouri. Once we hit Missouri, I was determined to find my mother. I had thought about it a lot, wondering what she would do, where she would go if she knew she only had a short time to live. I doubted that she would have stayed in her home there in Kansas City, and we were close to the archaeology site she had been working on for the last few years. I had been given the opportunity to visit the site the first year we had begun work, so I was familiar with where to find it. I figured if she wasn't there, I would try finding her in KC. I wasn't holding out much hope either way. I paused, drained the last of the chicory from my cup, and said, I noticed the cairn immediately. When we arrived at the cave, I was convinced that the full team had to have been there, since there was evidence of more than just Mom. It took me a while to go deeper into the cave. I was wondering where everyone went, even though it was obvious it had been a while. I had completely forgotten about the long passage. Finding your letter, even as it raised more questions, gave me some measure of peace. My eyes brimmed with tears. She wasn't alone when she passed. That means so much to me, to know that she had someone with her as she passed into the world of the spirits. I wiped at a tear that had escaped and began trickling down my cheek. And eventually, we came here, looking for you, Jess. Jess's cheeks were also wet with tears. Those months we spent with Madge were beautiful ones. She gave us so much love, acceptance, and peace. Even now, I remember it like it was yesterday. My faith in humans and life in general had been sorely tested, and Madge reminded me of all I had left to live for, all that I could be for Jacob, for myself and my family. Grandmother. That is what she asked us to call her, took us in, and taught us how to survive here, in this cave, through the winter. It is now March, late March, and no snow has fallen in several weeks. The temperatures are rising, and it is time for me to try to finish my journey home. I have a journal, the personal one she kept, Jess said suddenly. I can get it for you. I held up my hand. Tomorrow. Can I come again tomorrow? The sun had set, and the darkness had closed in. We were staying in town. That they let us in at all was a surprise. We tried months ago and were turned back. But apparently the militia is allowing traders and migrant workers in these days, and we had goods to trade, so we will be here for another day, perhaps two. Jess nodded. Yes, of course. Come by tomorrow. As we walked away from Jess and her family, I could feel their eyes on our backs, watching us. Kip slipped his fingers into mine.
Have you asked after Tina? She's pretty young. Younger than I thought.
The town doc vouched for her. Says she's smart as a whip. Young as she is, it's kids like her who will help us climb out of this hole we are in and return to a better future. I don't know you, and you don't know me, but I'm writing this letter and then hiding the box where only someone who knows Madge and the inner twists and turns of this cave will be able to find it. I have to be sure, you see. It still isn't safe. They have sent out soldiers hunting for us, and I don't know that they aren't still out there looking. The next day, Jess watched Penelope approach, her long-legged stride fluid on the broken pavement of the street. Jess could see that Sarah Turner had joined her, and that Penelope's husband, Kip, was not with them. Sarah was a kind woman. She had always treated Jess as an equal, and during those first months and years, she had championed Jess and her motley group more than once. Sarah was quite protective, in fact, which made Jess wonder about the older woman's past and that of her children, who were nearly the same age as Jess. Sarah had always been rather close-mouthed about where she had come from, or where Cody and Laura's father was. What would Sarah have to contribute to all of this? Jess wasn't sure what to think. A quick glance at David's face signaled trouble. Tina was his sister, and he had a right to his opinion, but for the first time Jess wondered what Tina wanted. Stay or go? Wasn't it up to her? After all, Tina was nearly the age that David had been when they had all first met in Clinton. He had been old enough to make a decision then, a decision that had taken him away from everything familiar, everything that reminded him of home. Shouldn't Tina have the right to make that same decision, even at the age of 10 years? Jess was conflicted, and she knew it showed in her face. Sarah took it in, smiled at her, and gave her a warm hug. Good morning, Jess. Since her daughter Laura had married Todd Stevens, the laugh lines on her face had deepened. The births of Laura and Todd's 2 boys had brought happiness, along with something Jess could only describe as longing to Sarah's face. Jess wondered if Sarah was thinking of the husband she had left behind. Jess had listened to so many stories, so many unfinished, unknown fates of loved ones. It was, perhaps, the most haunting part of her job as historian, the unknown fates of so many. Sarah's story was one of dozens. It was hours before dinner, and they had had lunch just 2 hours earlier. But Sarah produced a loaf of her sourdough bread, a favorite of David's. That was combined with a bag of fruits that Kip had sent along, payment for some picking work they had both done earlier in the day. Jess and David, along with Tina, Sarah, and Penelope, sat down for a bite to eat and some conversation. It was stilted at first, mainly due to David, who felt cornered and resentful. Jess laid her hand on his knee, reminding him silently that she was his ally. He stared at her hand as she made small talk with Penelope and Sarah, concentrated on the long, tapered fingers. They were rough with calluses, but still delicate. He looked at them and tried to calm his fears of losing his sister, knowing how much she wanted to go. Tina had come to him that morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, and quietly folded herself on the floor of his room so she didn't wake Jacob. Her room was right next door, shared with Becca and Aaron, when one or the other wasn't curled in bed next to Jess. "I want to go with her," was all that she had said when he opened one bleary eye and focused on her. They had engaged in a silent contest of wills, him glaring, her just staring back, until he had finally turned away and pulled the covers over his head and tried to ignore her. When he had turned back over a few minutes later, she was gone. The small talk had progressed while he was wool gathering. Penelope was describing her mother's house in Kansas City. "It's over 130 years old, and solid brick. Surprisingly, it's rather intact, considering the dire situation that most residents were in before and during the collapse. Most of her books are still there," Penelope smiled at Jess. She wrote about all kinds of recent history, as well as anthropology. She had quite an obsession with Jesse James, and also had notes on Pendergast, a corrupt political boss in the early 20th century. She turned toward David, who just shrugged and shook his head. He had never heard of Jesse James or Pendergast. In any case, the house was gone through, but not much was taken, and it was empty when we visited it last week. We are planning to stay there and work with a medical group that is forming. She looked at Tina and smiled at her, then back to David, where her smile faltered a brief second. If it would be all right, Tina could come with us to Kansas City and stay in the house. There is plenty of room, and there are other students who she would be learning side by side with. You could come too, David, to see for yourself if you liked. A long silence ensued. All eyes were on David until Tina spoke up. "I want to go to Kansas City with you, Penelope. I want to learn how to be a doctor. It's all I've ever wanted to do." David closed his eyes for a moment, no doubt remembering her tiny hand in his, her matted hair in those weeks and months that had followed the deaths of their parents, the feel of her tiny body nestled against his. He could remember farther back, the first time he had seen her in the hospital, a tiny, red face, impossibly small, mewling cries that sounded like a tiny, sad kitten. They had never fought. With nearly 8 years between them, he had always been the oldest, the one she looked up to, and when they had been alone, lost in the rubble of a dead and broken town, she had depended on him for everything. It was only here in Belton that she had come into her own, as young as she was, defining her future, writing it on the wall with nothing short of an indelible marker. Her abilities, her intuitive understanding and curiosity about the healing arts had given her this opportunity. And who was he to say no? How could he? David thought of her being absent, not someone he saw every day, not in the garden or walking into town with freshly picked herbs for Dr. Ridley, and something deep in his chest twisted and pulled. She was all that he had of their former life, the only evidence he could show of the parents that he had lost. The words to say all that seemed to elude him. In the end, he simply stared at Jess's hand, still on his knee, and said,
"If Tina wants to go, then I guess that's what she should do."
"But if you find this, know that she died, surrounded by people who loved her. She was at peace, and I miss her dreadfully. Yours, Jess."